Imagine building the most powerful weapon ever created by human hands. A floating fortress so massive, so unstoppable, so terrifying in its sheer scale that your enemies would surrender just from seeing it on the horizon. Now imagine sending that weapon on a mission with no fuel for the return trip. No air cover. No real plan. Just a one-way journey into the jaws of the greatest naval air force ever assembled. That is the story of the Yamato. And what happened on April 7, 1945, in the waters of the East China Sea, is one of the most dramatic, heartbreaking, and extraordinary events in the entire history of naval warfare. This is not just a story about a ship. This is a story about pride, desperation, sacrifice, and the brutal collision between the old world and the new. Stay with me, because this story gets more intense with every single minute. To truly understand what the Yamato meant to Japan, you have to go back to the beginning. Not just the beginning of the ship, but the beginning of the world that created it. The year is 1905. Japan has just stunned the entire globe by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation has defeated a major European power in open naval combat. The Battle of Tsushima, where Japan annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, sent shockwaves through every naval ministry on Earth. Japan was no longer a curiosity. Japan was a power. And with that power came ambition. And with that ambition came the relentless, obsessive, almost religious pursuit of the ultimate warship. The Japanese Navy looked at the world around them and understood something clearly. They could not outproduce the United States or Great Britain in terms of sheer industrial volume. America had the steel. America had the factories. America had the population. If Japan tried to match America ship for ship, gun for gun, tank for tank, they would lose every single time. So the Japanese naval planners made a different decision. Instead of quantity, they would pursue quality. Instead of building many good ships, they would build a few perfect ships. Ships so powerful, so heavily armed, so impenetrable to enemy fire, that a handful of them could defeat entire enemy fleets. This was the doctrine that gave birth to the Yamato. Work on the design began in the early 1930s. The naval architects and engineers who sat down to plan this vessel were not just building a ship. They were building a philosophy, a statement, a declaration that Japan had arrived at the very pinnacle of naval technology and military power. The design process alone took years. Teams of engineers argued about displacement, about armor thickness, about gun caliber, about speed, about range. They ran calculations on paper and in tanks. They built models and tested them in water channels. They argued and revised and argued again. And slowly, out of all that intellectual effort, the Yamato began to take shape on paper. What they designed was simply staggering. The Yamato would displace over 72,000 tons when fully loaded. To put that in perspective, most battleships of the era displaced somewhere between 35,000 and 45,000 tons. The Yamato was nearly double the size of ships that were already considered enormous. She would stretch 863 feet from bow to stern. That is nearly 3 football fields laid end to end. She would stand so tall above the waterline that her superstructure alone was like a building rising from the sea. Her beam, the width of the ship, was over 121 feet. She was so wide, so massive, that she could not even fit through the Panama Canal. She was physically too big for the most famous waterway on Earth. But the size was just the beginning. What truly set the Yamato apart from every other warship ever built were her guns. 9 guns, organized in 3 triple turrets, each gun with a barrel 18.1 inches in diameter. Let that number sink in. 18.1 inches. The largest naval guns ever mounted on any warship in the history of the world, before or since. For comparison, American Iowa-class battleships, which were themselves considered terrifyingly powerful, carried 16-inch guns. The Yamato's guns were bigger, significantly bigger. Each shell fired by those monstrous guns weighed approximately 3,200 pounds. A single shell from the Yamato weighed more than a full-sized family car. And those guns could hurl that shell more than 26 miles. 26 miles. You could stand in one city and shoot a shell that would land in another city entirely. The armor protecting those guns was equally extraordinary. The gun turrets themselves were protected by up to 26 inches of hardened steel. The main armored belt running along the sides of the ship was 16 inches thick. The deck armor, designed to deflect plunging shells fired from long range, was up to 9 inches thick. The Yamato was not just a gun platform. She was a floating fortress. The designers had calculated the armor so precisely that they believed she could withstand hits from virtually any weapon in existence at the time. She was, by every metric the Japanese could devise, unsinkable. To move all of that mass through the water, the Yamato was fitted with 4 massive steam turbines driving 4 propeller shafts, producing a total of 150,000 shaft horsepower. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of mechanical power. Despite her enormous weight, those turbines could push her through the water at 27 knots. Not quite as fast as some lighter cruisers or destroyers, but fast enough. Fast enough to chase down anything she needed to destroy, and fast enough to escape from anything she needed to avoid. She carried enough fuel oil in her tanks to range across enormous distances of open ocean, though as we will learn, that fuel would one day become a matter of life and death. Her crew was equally impressive in scale. The Yamato required approximately 2,700 men to operate at full capacity. 2,700 human beings living, working, eating, sleeping, fighting, and dying within her steel walls. She had her own hospital, her own bakery, her own supply systems, water treatment, communications networks, fire control systems of extraordinary complexity. She was a small city floating on the sea, a self-contained world of steel and fire and human ambition. Construction began in 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal in Japan. The shipyard itself had to be modified to accommodate her unprecedented size. New cranes were built. New dry docks were constructed. The workforce assembling her numbered in the thousands. And the entire project was wrapped in the tightest secrecy Japan could manage. The Japanese government was deeply worried about what would happen if the United States or Britain learned the true specifications of what was being built. Foreign observers were kept away from the shipyard. Workers were sworn to secrecy. The dimensions of the ship were classified at the highest level. Japan wanted the world to be surprised. They wanted that moment when enemy navies first encountered the Yamato to be a moment of pure shock and terror. She was launched on August 8, 1940. When her enormous hull slid into the water for the first time, the displacement of water was so massive that the wave it created splashed over the sides of the dry dock and flooded part of the shipyard. Even her birth was violent. She was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war she had been built to fight had already begun. And this is where the story starts to get complicated. Because the Yamato arrived just as the entire strategic landscape of naval warfare was shifting beneath Japan's feet in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed partly to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to consolidate its conquests and build a defensive perimeter so strong that America would eventually negotiate peace rather than fight through it. The attack had targeted the American battleships anchored in Pearl Harbor specifically because battleships were understood to be the decisive weapon of naval warfare. Sink the battleships, and you sink the enemy's ability to fight back. That was the logic. But something went wrong with that logic. Something that the Japanese planners had not fully accounted for. The American aircraft carriers were not in port on December 7, 1941. They were out at sea on exercises and supply runs. And because they were at sea, they survived. And because they survived, the balance of power in the Pacific was never quite what Japan needed it to be. Because what Pearl Harbor actually demonstrated, in ways that took time to fully sink in, was not the supremacy of the battleship. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the supremacy of the aircraft carrier. It was carrier-launched aircraft that had devastated the American fleet, not enemy battleships. Planes had done what guns could not. And that lesson, that air power had fundamentally changed naval warfare forever, would come back to haunt the Yamato in the most devastating possible way. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, fell in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Japanese forces advanced into New Guinea and threatened Australia. The empire was expanding at a rate that shocked even the Japanese themselves. And at the center of all this Japanese naval power was the combined fleet, and theoretically at the center of the combined fleet was the Yamato. She became the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most brilliant naval commander Japan possessed. But here is the painful irony that would define the Yamato's entire war. Despite being the most powerful warship ever built, despite carrying guns that could destroy anything afloat, the Yamato spent much of the early part of the war doing very little. She sat at anchor. She steamed between ports. She served as a floating headquarters. She fired her guns in anger almost not at all during these crucial early months. The reason was simple and devastating. Fuel. The Imperial Japanese Navy was running desperately short of the oil it needed to power its ships. Japan had virtually no domestic oil production. All of her oil came from imports. And as the war progressed, American submarines were systematically destroying the tankers carrying that oil. Every ton of fuel burned by the Yamato was fuel that could not be used elsewhere. She was simply too expensive to operate. The greatest battleship ever built was being kept in port because Japan could not afford to fill her tanks. This was the paradox at the heart of Japanese naval strategy in World War II. They had built this magnificent instrument of destruction and then found themselves unable to use it. While American carriers and their aircraft were reshaping the Pacific War through battles like Coral Sea, Midway, and the Guadalcanal Campaign, the Yamato was largely sitting idle. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the true turning point of the Pacific War, and the Yamato was present, but played almost no role. Japan lost 4 of its precious fleet carriers at Midway, and with them, the irreplaceable experienced pilots and air crews that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive, and the Yamato was still barely fighting. She did see action at the Battle of the Sea Beyond Sea in October 1944 during the enormous complex of engagements that Americans call the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was the largest naval battle in history by some measures, a desperate Japanese gambit to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte in the Philippines. The plan was complex and daring. The Japanese would use their remaining carriers, now largely without aircraft or trained pilots, as decoys to lure the American carriers away. Then the Yamato and the rest of the Japanese surface fleet would punch through the straits of the Philippines and destroy the vulnerable American troop transports and supply ships. Sink those ships, and the invasion of the Philippines would collapse. That was the plan. During the Battle of the Sea Beyond Sea, American carrier aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet repeatedly throughout the day. The Yamato was hit by 2 bombs and 1 torpedo. One bomb hit nearly took out a main turret. The torpedo hit caused flooding that killed hundreds of men. But she survived. She kept fighting. She pushed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night and emerged into the Philippine Sea to the east. And then, in what became known as the Battle off Samar, the Yamato and the Japanese surface fleet encountered something they had not expected. Instead of the powerful American fleet carriers they feared, they found themselves facing a group of tiny escort carriers and their destroyer escorts. These were small ships, slow ships, ships with thin armor and light weapons. They had been screening the invasion transports. They were, in every military sense, far outmatched by the Yamato and her companions. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary episodes of the entire war. The American destroyer escorts, knowing they were outgunned and outmatched in every conceivable way, attacked. They charged the Japanese surface fleet. These tiny destroyers launched torpedoes and fired their guns at battleships and heavy cruisers, creating such confusion and smoke and chaos that the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, became convinced he was facing the main American carrier fleet. The sacrifice of those small American ships, and the extraordinary courage and skill of their crews, gave Kurita enough doubt and hesitation that he eventually turned his fleet around and withdrew without delivering the devastating blow he might have struck. The Yamato fired her massive main guns during this battle, including its surface targets, a rare occurrence. But the opportunity was lost. Japan had come agonizingly close to a potentially war-altering victory and pulled back at the crucial moment. By early 1945, the situation for Japan was desperate beyond description. American forces had recaptured the Philippines. American bombers were striking Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands. American submarines had essentially strangled Japanese overseas trade and oil supply. The economy was collapsing. The military was running out of everything: aircraft, ships, fuel, trained pilots, and perhaps most importantly, time. American forces were advancing island by island, ever closer to the Japanese home islands. In February 1945, American Marines landed on Iwo Jima, just 750 miles from Tokyo, and fought one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War to take it. In April 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, the largest island of the Ryukyu chain, just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland. The invasion of Japan itself was clearly coming. It was in this context of absolute desperation that the plan for Operation Tengo was born. Okinawa was the key. If American forces established airfields on Okinawa, they could provide air cover for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese military was willing to do almost anything to prevent that from happening. And one of the things they were willing to do was send the Yamato to Okinawa, not as part of a coordinated fleet action, not with air cover, not with a realistic plan for victory, but essentially as a suicide mission, a gesture, a sacrifice so dramatic and so visible that it might inspire the Japanese people to continue fighting. That was the plan. The Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, would sail to Okinawa, beach herself deliberately on the shallow waters near the shore, and use her enormous guns as fixed artillery to destroy the American invasion forces. She would fight until she was destroyed, and her destruction would be so glorious, so heroically Japanese in its defiance, that it would serve as a symbol and a call to arms. The plan was called Operation Tengo. It was presented to the naval leadership, and many of the senior admirals and officers were horrified by it. They knew what it meant. They knew that without adequate air cover, the Yamato would be destroyed by American aircraft long before she ever reached Okinawa. They knew they were sending 2,700 men to their deaths for a symbolic gesture. Some of them said so directly in meetings where the plan was discussed. They argued that the fuel and the crew could be better used elsewhere. They pointed out the futility of sending a surface fleet against American air power without any air cover of their own. But the decision was made at the highest levels of the Japanese military command. The Yamato would go. The fuel situation made the reality of the mission unmistakably clear to everyone involved. Japan had so little oil left that the Yamato could only be provided with enough fuel for the one-way trip to Okinawa. There was not enough fuel to bring her back. This was not a mission with a plan for survival. This was an organized death. The officers knew it. The crew knew it. When word spread among the sailors about the nature of the mission, the reactions were varied and deeply human. Some men were stoic, accepting death as their duty and their honor. Some were terrified. Some were angry. Some were proud. Some quietly made peace with the knowledge that they would not see their families again. Letters were written home that could never be sent before the ship sailed. Personal effects were distributed. Sake was shared. Men who had never spoken deeply to one another found themselves in unexpected conversations about life and death and duty and home. On April 6, 1945, the Yamato left the Tokuyama fuel depot with her small escort. She had with her the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. 10 ships in total. A tiny fraction of the fleet that Japan had sent into battle just a few years earlier. No aircraft carriers provided air cover. No submarines screened ahead. Just those 10 ships, sailing south into the East China Sea, toward Okinawa, toward the massive American fleet, toward their end. As they sailed out of the Bungo Strait and into open water, American submarines spotted them almost immediately. The submarines radioed the contact report back to the American fleet. The Americans began preparing their response. The night of April 6th to 7th passed quietly aboard the Yamato. The sea was rough. The weather had closed in, bringing low clouds and choppy water. Some of the men ate their evening meals in the mess. Some prayed. Some slept. The officers on the bridge watched their charts and their instruments and said little. Captain Jiro Nomura commanded the Yamato. He knew what was coming. Everyone on that ship knew what was coming. American air power would find them in the morning. The only question was whether they would reach Okinawa before the planes arrived. They would not. At dawn on April 7th, 1945, the weather began to clear. American search aircraft from Task Force 58 were already aloft. Task Force 58 was the greatest collection of naval air power ever assembled. 16 aircraft carriers, 1,200 aircraft, destroyer screens, cruisers, battleships, the full might of the American Pacific Fleet, blooded by 3 years of hard fighting and sharpened to a razor's edge by experience and technology and industrial production that Japan simply could not match. At approximately 8:23 in the morning, a search plane from the carrier Essex spotted the Japanese fleet. The pilot banked his aircraft, confirmed what he was seeing, and sent a contact report back to the fleet. The Yamato had been found. Within minutes, the American carrier task groups began launching strike aircraft. The first wave was already being brought up from the hangar decks to the flight decks. Engines were being warmed up. Pilots were climbing into their cockpits. The machinery of American air power was spinning up toward full speed. Aboard the Yamato, the lookouts spotted the American search plane. The alarm was sounded. The crew went to battle stations. The anti-aircraft guns were manned. The gun crews prepared to fight off the attack they knew was coming. The Yamato had a substantial anti-aircraft battery, which had been significantly reinforced throughout the war as the threat from aircraft became undeniable. She carried dozens of 25mm anti-aircraft guns arranged around her decks, along with larger weapons. But anti-aircraft gunnery in World War II was extraordinarily difficult. You were trying to hit fast-moving aircraft with guns that had to be aimed, elevated, and fired with perfect timing to put a shell in the right place in the sky at exactly the right moment. And if the attacking aircraft came in large numbers from multiple directions simultaneously, even a well-defended ship could be overwhelmed. The first American strike, consisting of approximately 280 aircraft of various types, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts, arrived over the Japanese fleet at around 12:37 in the afternoon. The attackers had been briefed carefully. They knew their priorities. The Yamato was the primary target. Sink the Yamato, and the rest of the mission collapsed. The American pilots had been trained extensively in anti-shipping tactics. The torpedo bombers would come in low and slow, threading through the anti-aircraft fire to release their weapons. The dive bombers would come screaming down from high altitude to put bombs on the deck. The fighters would suppress the anti-aircraft guns and shoot down any Japanese aircraft that appeared, though none did. When the first aircraft appeared on the horizon, visible from the Yamato's deck as small dark specks that grew rapidly larger, the ship began maneuvering. She turned and twisted as best she could, trying to complicate the targeting solutions of the incoming attackers. For a ship of her size, she was actually fairly maneuverable, but she was not maneuverable enough. Not against this mini aircraft, attacking from every direction at once, coordinated with a precision and professionalism that reflected years of hard-won experience. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened up with everything they had. The noise was indescribable. Hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, filling the sky around the ship with bursting shells and tracers. Some aircraft were hit. Some went down. The American attack was not without cost. But the pilots pressed on. They had been trained to press on. They had orders to press on. And there were simply too many of them for the Yamato's guns to stop. The first torpedo hit the Yamato at approximately 12:41 in the afternoon. Then another. Then a bomb came down through the sky and detonated on the deck. Then another torpedo. The explosions were enormous, each one sending columns of water and flame and smoke into the sky. The crew fought frantically to control the flooding. Damage control parties raced through the ship's corridors, sealing compartments, manning pumps, trying to stop the water. The ship began to list. Her hull, for all its extraordinary armor, could not absorb an unlimited number of torpedo hits. Each torpedo punched a hole below the waterline, and through that hole the sea poured in with relentless, unstoppable pressure. The second wave of American aircraft arrived and attacked almost before the crew could recover from the first. More torpedoes, more bombs. The list was growing worse. Counterflooding, the process of deliberately flooding compartments on the opposite side of the ship to correct a list, was ordered and carried out. It helped temporarily, but the damage was too severe, too widespread, too ongoing. The third wave struck before the crew had any respite. More torpedoes. Another bomb. The list reached 12 degrees, then 15, then began to accelerate. On the bridge, officers were making desperate calculations. The engine rooms were still operating. The ship was still moving. But the flooding was beyond control now. Water was pouring into the ship faster than it could be pumped out. The list was increasing. When a ship lists beyond a certain point, it becomes impossible to correct. The center of gravity shifts past the point of no return. The ship rolls over. At approximately 2:05 in the afternoon, approximately 90 minutes after the attack began, the Yamato rolled to her port side. The list reached 90 degrees in seconds. Men who had been standing on her decks were thrown into the sea. Men who had been trapped below decks were trapped underwater. The enormous turrets, each one weighing over 2,700 tons, tore loose from their mountings as the ship inverted and fell toward the bottom. And then came the most catastrophic moment of all. When the Yamato rolled over and her hull was exposed to the sky, the fires that had been burning inside her reached her main ammunition magazines. The shells stored in those magazines, thousands of them, each one weighing over a ton, detonated simultaneously. The explosion was so enormous that it was visible from Kagoshima, on the southern tip of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. Over 20 miles away, witnesses described a mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke and fire rising miles into the sky. The explosion was heard even further away. American pilots circling the site pulled their aircraft away from the shockwave. Debris rained down over a wide area of ocean. And then, when the smoke and the water began to clear, the Yamato was gone. She had sunk in approximately 1,000 feet of water. She sank so fast, once she began to go, that many of the men who might have escaped from the upper decks were pulled down by the suction of the sinking hull. The Yahagi had already been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk or badly damaged. Of the approximately 3,332 men aboard the entire fleet, only 269 survivors were eventually recovered. The Yamato alone had carried a crew of roughly 2,700. Only 269 men from the entire task force made it home. The survivors' stories are almost impossible to fully comprehend. Men who had been blown off the deck by the explosion. Men who had managed to swim out of compartments that were flooding. Men who had clung to wreckage for hours in the cold, rough sea, watching their shipmates die around them. One survivor, Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, who later wrote a memoir about the experience, described the chaos of the final moments as something beyond the capacity of language to fully convey. He described watching his crewmates swept away. He described the roar of the explosion and the darkness that followed. He described floating in an oil-covered sea, surrounded by wreckage and bodies, waiting for rescue that eventually came, but came too late for the vast majority. The entire battle, from the first torpedo hit to the final explosion, lasted approximately 2 hours. 2 hours to destroy a ship that had taken years to design and build. 2 hours to kill over 2,400 men. 2 hours to erase what Japan had called its supreme weapon. The American losses in attacking the Yamato were 10 aircraft and 12 men. 10 aircraft and 12 men, against the greatest battleship ever built. The disparity tells you everything you need to know about the state of the war in April 1945, and about the fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare that had occurred since those pre-war Japanese engineers first sat down to design the ultimate gun platform. The news of the Yamato's loss was kept from the Japanese public for some time. The military government, which controlled all information reaching ordinary citizens, understood that the sinking of the Yamato would be devastating to morale. People had been told for years that the Yamato was a symbol of Japanese invincibility. Telling them that it had been sunk in 2 hours by carrier aircraft before it even reached its destination was not something the government was prepared to do immediately. The survivors were kept isolated, their accounts controlled. The battle was eventually acknowledged, but with carefully managed framing. The loss of the Yamato did not end the Battle of Okinawa, which continued for months in some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire Pacific War. Japanese forces on Okinawa fought with the same suicidal determination that had characterized every battle as American forces closed in on the home islands. The kamikaze aircraft attacks on the American fleet around Okinawa were unprecedented in their scale and their ferocity. Thousands of Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their planes into American ships, sinking dozens and damaging hundreds. The fighting on the island itself cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides, and enormous civilian casualties among the Okinawan population caught in the middle. Okinawa fell in late June 1945, and with its fall, the strategic position of Japan became untenable. American air forces were bombing Japanese cities almost at will. American submarines had essentially cut off all maritime supply lines. The Japanese economy was in a state of near-total collapse, and American planners were developing Operation Downfall, the plan for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese lives. It was in this context that the decision was made to use the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. On August 9, another fell on Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio for the first time in his life. In carefully chosen words, he announced that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had dreamed of the Yamato and built it and sent it to its death, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The wreck of the Yamato was discovered in the 1980s by Japanese divers and researchers. She lies in about 1,120 feet of water in the East China Sea, broken into two main pieces. The massive explosion that destroyed her when her magazines detonated split the hull. The bow section and the stern section lie some distance apart on the ocean floor. In the years since her discovery, multiple expeditions have visited the wreck, some using remotely operated vehicles and underwater cameras to photograph and document what remains. The images they have brought back are haunting. The great turrets, those enormous guns that were supposed to change the course of naval history, lie scattered on the seabed. The hull, its armor plating eaten by rust and covered in sea life, still retains the basic shape of the ship that once terrified naval planners around the world. In Japan, the Yamato has become something far more complex than a simple symbol of military power. She has become a cultural touchstone, appearing in films, novels, manga, anime, and works of art. The most famous of these is perhaps the 1974 science fiction anime series Space Battleship Yamato, in which the spirit of the ship is resurrected in the far future as a spacecraft, sailing through the cosmos to save humanity. That series, and its subsequent films and reboots, have introduced the Yamato to generations of Japanese young people who had no living memory of World War II. The ship has become something almost mythological, a vessel for examining questions of duty, sacrifice, futility, and honor that cut to the heart of Japanese cultural identity. There is also a museum in Kure, the city where the Yamato was built, dedicated to her memory. The Yamato Museum contains a scale model of the ship, artifacts recovered from the wreck site, and extensive documentation of her construction and service. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come every year. Many of them are Japanese, coming to understand a chapter of their history that is still deeply complicated and emotionally charged. Some come with pride. Some come with grief. Some come with a complex mixture of both, grappling with the legacy of a war that brought Japan such catastrophic suffering and inflicted such suffering on others across Asia and the Pacific. The story of the Yamato raises profound questions that historians and military scholars have debated ever since. Was she a strategic mistake from the very beginning? The resources poured into building her and her sister ship Musashi, who was also sunk by American aircraft in 1944 at Leyte Gulf, could have been used differently. Could those resources have built more aircraft carriers? More aircraft? More submarines? Could they have changed the strategic balance in ways that the Yamato herself never could? Many analysts believe the answer is yes. The Yamato represented the peak of a technology, the big gun battleship, that was already being made obsolete by the time she was launched. She was the ultimate expression of a naval doctrine that was dying even as she was being built. This was not unique to Japan. Naval planners around the world struggled to absorb the implications of carrier-based air power in the early years of the war. The British lost the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse to Japanese aircraft off Malaya in December 1941. American battleships had been devastated at Pearl Harbor. Battleship after battleship was finding itself unable to operate in waters where it did not have adequate air cover. The lesson was the same everywhere, taught repeatedly in blood and wreckage and sunken steel. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. But the Yamato was not built in hindsight. She was built in the 1930s, by men working with the knowledge and the doctrine and the assumptions of their time. And by the standards of those assumptions, she was a masterpiece. She was everything her designers intended her to be. She was the most powerful gun platform ever built. It was not her designers who failed. It was the world that changed around her, faster and more completely than anyone had predicted. And perhaps that is the most universal lesson in her story. Throughout history, military powers have invested enormous resources in building the ultimate weapon of their era, only to find that history moves on and renders that weapon obsolete before it can fulfill its promise. The Maginot Line. The strategic bomber as the decisive weapon of conventional warfare. The submarine as the ultimate naval weapon. The tank as invulnerable to infantry. Each generation finds its own version of the Yamato, the supreme weapon that arrives just as the world changes to make it vulnerable. There is something deeply human in the story of the Yamato and the men who served aboard her. The designers who poured their genius into creating something extraordinary. The workers who built her with their hands over years of labor. The sailors who lived aboard her and called her home. The officers who commanded her and knew, in those final days, that they were sailing to their deaths. They were not abstractions or symbols. They were people, with families waiting for them, with dreams and fears and memories of ordinary life before the war consumed everything. Their deaths were real and terrible and deserved to be remembered as such. The 2 hours in which the Yamato was destroyed on April 7, 1945, were among the most intense and consequential 2 hours in naval history. In that brief window of time, American naval aviation demonstrated beyond any remaining doubt that it had achieved a level of power and proficiency that no surface fleet, no matter how heavily armed or armored, could survive without adequate air cover. The doctrine of the big gun battleship died in those waters, definitively and finally. And with it died the strategy and the hope that Japan had pinned to its ultimate weapon. When the last survivor was pulled from the oil-covered water of the East China Sea, when the last echo of that catastrophic explosion had faded, what remained was the memory. The memory of 2,400 men who had sailed into battle on a ship that was the greatest of its kind, knowing they would not return. The memory of extraordinary craftsmanship and engineering skill poured into a weapon that history had already made obsolete. The memory of a nation's pride and desperation, fused together in one final, doomed, magnificent gesture. The Yamato still lies on the floor of the East China Sea. She has been there for more than 80 years. The sea life has covered her in a strange beauty that she never had in life. Fish swim through her corridors. Coral grows on her gun barrels. The cold, dark water presses down on the ruins of what was once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And somewhere in that darkness, scattered on the ocean floor among the wreckage of the greatest battleship ever built, lie the remains of the men who sailed her to the end. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their sacrifice, whatever one thinks of the cause they served, deserves acknowledgement. They were sailors who did their duty as they understood it, in the worst of circumstances, on a ship that should never have been sent where it was sent, on a mission that should never have been ordered. They were human beings caught in the grinding machinery of a war that consumed everything it touched. The Yamato was built to be unsinkable. She was built to be invincible. She was built to change the course of history. And in a way, she did. Just not in the way her creators intended. She changed history by being destroyed, by demonstrating so completely and so dramatically the limits of even the most extraordinary weapon when the world has moved beyond it, by becoming a story that still resonates 80 years later, not as a story of triumph, but as a story of human ambition and human limitation and the terrible costs of war. And so the Yamato rests, beneath the sea that she once ruled, or tried to rule, in those brief years when it seemed possible that a gun big enough, a ship strong enough, might change the fate of nations. She rests, and she waits, and she remembers, in the way that only the sea and the dead can truly remember. The greatest battleship ever built, sent on a suicide mission, destroyed in 2 hours, never forgotten. If you are moved by the story of the Yamato and the men who sailed her, if you want to understand more about the naval campaigns of the Pacific War, about the extraordinary technology and the human cost of this conflict, about the warriors on both sides who gave everything they had in the most destructive war in human history, then stay with this channel. Because we are just getting started. Every ship has a story. Every battle has a human face. And history, when you look at it closely enough, is never just about weapons and strategy. It is always, at its deepest level, about people. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring it together.